Well, welcome to TimeXtender Tuesdays, episode 13. Taylor and Joseph and I are super excited to have you here. And I think we're through all the housekeeping stuff. So with that, Joseph, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Jay. So today we're going to be talking about adding data sources to TimeXtender and best practices around that. Now, through the course of these videos, we've already talked a little bit about data sources. If you want to look back to previous episodes, we did one on adding an Azure Data Factory data source and using the integration runtime to connect to on-prem SQL. It's a really cool way to load data. But there are many other options to load data in TimeXtender. There's actually quite a few options. How many, you ask? Well, let's find out. So there's in total, there's currently 259 total native connectors in TimeXtender. So if you have a TimeXtender subscription, you can connect to 259 different data sources directly out of the box. Now, that doesn't include any third-party providers that you've installed on the server. Cool thing about the ODX server is that when you install third-party providers on that same server where ODX server is installed, you'll also be able to utilize that provider, and you'll see it displayed in the list of data sources, and you'll be able to schedule it and start loading data from there into an Azure Data Lake in Parquet files, which is pretty cool stuff. So in addition to that, we have the privilege to be able to use all of these different CData connectors. I believe there's about 230 of these connectors. So we partner with a company called CData, and this allows us to be able to provide all of their providers through our software at no additional cost to our customers. And this is really great because this team at CData are constantly developing and upgrading their providers. Their full-time jobs are just to develop and maintain all of these different data source connectors. So we get that benefit built into our software as is. In addition to that, we have a number of custom providers that we've added, and the Azure Data Factory providers on top of all of that. Now, as you can see, with all of these different providers allowed out of the box, we actually provide more connectivity than any of the other major data management platforms on the market. And you can actually see that Data Factory, which is the one that I hear most often, is an incredible, very powerful platform, but you can see that the number of connectors that are available there really is less than half than what TimeXtender has to offer. And we'll talk a little bit about why you would use Data Factory and when to use Data Factory versus some of these other options that we have available. Okay, so what are the different CData providers that we do have? Well, you can see from this list, it is fairly extensive. We don't have enough time in our session today to go over every single one of them, but as you can see from this list of logos, pretty much any data out there that you need to connect to, you can get connected to very quickly using CData. And I'm going to show you how to use some of these providers in the demo today. But you can see the different categories, right? Relational database systems, files, big data, CRMs, right? ERP systems, marketing systems, accounting and finance. So lots of different categories, lots of variety of different data sources and connectivity that's available. If you want to learn more about these different data sources, you can go to CData's website and you can find some more information. The category of providers that we use are the ADO providers. So if you look in their website, there'll be an option for ADO. You click that, you'll see a list of all the CData providers that are exposed through the ODX server. Okay, in addition to all of the CData providers, of course, as we covered in the previous session, we have the Azure Data Factory data sources. Now, these are mostly relational database systems, but as you can see, there's also Azure Data Lake in there as well. Access is in there. So a lot of the more common on-prem ERP systems are going to be stored in here. And this is where a lot of organizations have a massive amount of data stored on an on-prem SQL server. Maybe it's a cloud SQL server, but it's likely stored in one of these providers. And you can use the Azure Data Factory pipelines to pull that data in. Now, I want to talk briefly. It looks like we do have a question here. Taylor, you have your hand up?
Yeah, thank you. So, with something like a data lake, obviously you could have a bunch of different file formats in there. And I noticed in the files, we have like, say, CSV and Parquet and Avro. So when there's kind of two different ways to connect to one of these types of data, how would you say you would figure out which one is the right one to use?
Yeah, great question. That is a fantastic question. It's a question I actually get quite often. How should we connect to this data when there are multiple different options available to me? Well, I want to talk real quick about the architecture, right? What is the compute that's being used to pull this data in? Now, there are two different compute that's possible, two different options for compute that are possible in the operational data exchange. And that is the engine that's going to transport this data from the data source into the data lake. Now, that first option is the on-prem on the ODX server using that machine's CPU and memory. So, and that is typically handled by ADO, right? ADO is the software framework where all of these providers, these CData providers and many of the providers you have installed on your system are wrapped in ADO. And this is what allows that machine, that virtual machine, is often a virtual machine where the ODX server is stored, to move that data. So that virtual machine is going to be connecting to that data source using the CPU and memory of that machine to ingest the data, package it in Parquet files, and then push that out to the Azure Data Lake. That's what's going to allow you that major flexibility of all the 230 different data sources. But now there's also the option to pick one of these Azure Data Factory sources. And when you're using, so this is the other option for compute, this handling or movement of data. And that's when you use Azure Data Factory, one of these data sources, it's actually using the Azure Data Factory engine to load that data. The data actually isn't being moved through the VM at all. And this can be an ideal option when you have larger data sources. So if you have larger data sources that are, 15, 30, 50, 100, 1,000, up to a terabyte, 15, 30 gigabytes up to a terabyte of data, an Azure Data Factory data source is going to be the ideal option, because Azure Data Factory is able to use the scale out architecture. So it actually is able to spin up multiple nodes behind the scenes as part of this managed service and use this copy action to copy the data from that on-prem source and load it directly into the Azure Data Lake. So if you have very large data sets and you're moving massive amounts of data, Azure Data Factory is going to be the ideal option for that. However, for most workloads, a lot of the more common workloads, the CData data sources and the other built-in data sources in TimeXtender are going to work exceptionally fine. Azure Data Factory takes a little while to actually spin up. So if it is a smaller data source, Azure Data Factory might actually take longer than CData or one of the other options, the ADO options. So for smaller data sources, CData is going to be much more agile and quick. For larger data sources, Azure Data Factory is more scalable. So great. Thank you for that question. Okay. So we've covered that, different types of data sources that are available in TimeXtender. Let's go ahead and jump into the demo. So for today's demo, we're going to use one of the CData data sources, one of the more common ones, which is a generic REST connector, getting connected to a REST provider. So let's go ahead and walk through that today. Let me move my screens around here. I need to get some links from our online training that we're going to use for this demo. But let's talk about the prerequisites. If you want to follow along today, you are going to need an app server created and running TimeXtender. Of course, you're going to need this ODX storage. In this setup, I'm using the Azure Data Lake storage. Of course, SQL Server storage will work just fine as well. And then there's the read access to the data source. Of course, you need to be able to read and consume the data from that data source. The nice thing about all of our data sources is they only require read permissions. That is one thing that's very important to our software team, and our vision for our software is we're not writing back to data sources ever. We're only reading from them, so minimal security requirements are necessary in those data sources. Okay, moving on. All right, so we're going to go through. I'm going to open up the virtual machine, the server we've been using for TimeXtender Tuesdays. We're going to add a new data source, and we're going to look through the different options available. We are going to add a REST provider. We're going to look into the CData guides that are available for all these different data sources, how to browse through those guides, but then how to work with these this REST connector specifically, and how you might use that to connect to a web service of your own. Okay, let's jump right in. So this is, again, the same VM I've been using throughout this training, throughout the TimeXtender Tuesdays sessions. I have here just a simple TimeXtender setup with the ODX server running, and you can see that open right here. I can go in and let's right-click here and add a data source. Now, the first thing this is going to do is it's going to ask me to configure a name, define a name for my data source, and then go in with the list of providers and allow me to select from that list. One important thing I would like to mention here is that the short name, while it's created automatically from the long name, you can modify it, but it is going to be static. You're not able to change that short name once a data source is created. You actually need to, if you wanted to change the short name, you would need to delete the data source and recreate that. And that's important because the data lake folder structure is dependent on that short name, but also the DW source code in TimeXtender is also dependent on that short name too, and that's why we keep that static. So I'm going to just call this REST for now. This will be my REST data source. Click next, and here we'll have the list of different providers that we have available. As I mentioned, it is a fairly extensive list here. As you can see, a lot of these actually have different versions. So that count that we gave you, 259, is a unique count. It's not counting these multiple different versions that are available. But essentially, when you're looking through and you find the one you want, you typically want to go with the latest, with the one that has the highest version number. You only need to use these older versions if you have a specific use case or a specific need for that. But you can browse through the list and see the extensive list that is available. You can also use the filter box here to put in what you want to search for. So I'm going to just put in REST. And we'll see here we do have just all of the REST providers. And I'm going to use this REST 2021. Now, important thing to know is that the REST provider is a generic provider that allows you to connect to a REST API. Now, a REST API is the API that's behind most web services. This is something that has to be built by the application developers of that service. So they have to build this API and provide it as a service. Not all web services have a REST API, but many do. So you're able to look at the API documentation. Oftentimes you can just do a Google search for, whatever the web service name is, for example, Spotify, and type in API. So right now, if you go to the Google and you type in Spotify API, it'll bring you to the documentation that guides you in how to connect to the data source. What are the different endpoints, how to authenticate against the data source, and get through the password and login and all of those different pieces. We're not going to be talking too much about authentication today. We're just going to be looking into how to get connected to these REST endpoints and how to use and manipulate them. So one other thing I would like to mention is that what is behind a good majority of these other web services, these other services that are available by CData? They're actually REST APIs behind the scenes working. And CData has just developed a connector that makes it easier for us to be able to work with that REST API. You'll see here there's going to be multiple endpoints with this REST API, and I'm going to need to configure those endpoints manually, specifying each one. However, many of these already created providers by CData have the endpoints already specified behind the scenes, and so it allows you to connect to all of the different tables that might be available on the back end. All right, let's continue on. So we have this REST API. What I have is I have an Azure Data Lake, Azure Blob Storage, and I've put some JSON files in that blob storage, and we're going to connect to those JSON files. It's important to know that in doing this, the what you're seeing and your experience from here is identical to connecting to a REST API. It's very, very similar. So REST API is going to give you endpoints. For those of you that do want to follow along, I am using the Connect to REST API SuperBikes exercise in our online training. So if you go to learn.timextender.com, you'll also see that link pushed through the chat in just a second here. You can go and you can see these different endpoints as I'm using them. But I do want to show you an example. Let's open a web browser, and I have the endpoint I want to connect to. And just like a REST API, once you've authenticated, you can actually put the endpoint into a browser, and you can see that data being shown on screen. So this is the data that's in the JSON file behind the scenes. I'm going to put this into the REST connector, and we're going to get connected to this data. All right, so I'm going to start with the actual the customer's endpoint. And the first thing we want to do here is we want to go to the section here called connection. And inside there's a value called URI. This is the main connection destination that the REST data source is going to look for data. So I have this. It's already specified by default that the format is going to be in JSON, and it's going to be a JSON document. So I already have that set up for me. So I can just quickly test the connection and make sure I get connected to that data source. Good. So that's all I need to do here. This is an open data source, so any of you can use this on your own time if you'd like. But it also means that I don't have to authenticate, which is nice. We will cover authentication in another session. So I'm going to hit next here. I'm going to say all tables in the data source. Yeah, and we'll finish this up and add a transfer task. So we'll add that in. I'm just going to call this transfer. And we'll click next and all tables next, and we'll just finish that up. So I have a synchronize, I've synchronized, and I have a transfer. The thing is I've only added a single endpoint. But what I want is actually there's 3 endpoints in there. I want to connect to all 3 of those endpoints as different tables. Now I could just add another REST data source, put in another URI, and I have 2 data sources one data source for each endpoint, but that can get really cumbersome, difficult to manage. What if you have 30, 50 different tables in there? You're going to have a lot of different data sources to manage. I'm going to show you another way to handle that. So let's go to the CData data source. Again, connecting to this REST API, we have the URI specified right here. Another option that is in miscellaneous here is the generate schema files. So by generating the schema files, it's going to create a file known as an RSD file. And this file is created by the CData data source. And we can use it to generate and specify that URI in a file rather than right here in the data source itself. All I need to do is define where I want to save this schema file. So I'm going to go here into this PC, and we'll go in the C drive, and we do have the CData folder, and then we have REST and SuperBikes. Okay, I want to make sure that this is empty. So give me 1 second here. I just want to make sure that this is still empty from the last time I used this. C drive, C data. Okay, so I still have some stuff in there, so I want to clear that up. So we're, again, want to start from scratch here. We have our REST SuperBikes folder, and we're going to load our schema files into that location. So we've turned on generate schema files right here on use, and then we've put in a location for our schema files to land in. Okay, so we're got to make sure that we're connected. Looks like we're connected. Click OK, and I'm going to synchronize. That synchronize is what's going to initiate that use of the data source. We are running a little bit out of time here, so I'm going to speed up a little bit. So we did just run that data source, and we synchronized that, and let's see if it generated the schema file for us. Good. So we have this customers.rsd file. What I can do is I can open this with Notepad, and we'll see in here it's specified the schema. So we have the field names, the data types. We also have that URI right here. And that's important because it's going to use this URI to connect to additional endpoints. So I'm going to go back to TimeXtender, and let's add in another endpoint. Okay, let's add in the products endpoint from. Okay, paste that in there. Okay, we'll click OK, and again, synchronize. Okay, so this is going to synchronize that data source, and once it's synchronized, it's going to create another RSD file in that folder and allow me to connect to both endpoints. And now we have customers and products. Okay, let's do it one final time here for the sales endpoint. And we're going to scroll down to the URI. Click OK. And once again, synchronize. All right, take a look at our folder and let's refresh this. Okay, good. So we have customers, products, and sales all added. We have those RSD files available. So now I know I'm connected to all three of those different endpoints. We can clarify this by using the Data Source Explorer. And we can see, okay, what tables are available in this data source. We see we have customers, we have products, all of those fields, and we have sales. We can also use the query tool, which is a very cool tool, allows us to write SQL and query the underlying data source directly. Not too many tools allow you to write in plain SQL to query a REST API. And this is actually a really cool thing. So we can drag in customers. I can customize this query all I need to, and it'll just return, again, writing in plain SQL, and it'll return the values back. I can even join it with other tables and communicate with the REST API that way. Let's close that out. I do want to transfer this data source. I'm going to hit execute. And now it's going to take those three different tables that I've added, again, by specifying those different RSD files, and it's going to transfer them into my data lake. Let's open up my Microsoft Azure Storage Explorer. I'm looking at my TX Tuesdays container here. Say refresh. Okay, good. So it created the folder. We go into REST. We have our three different tables, customers, products, and sales. All right, and we have our data folder, and again, our Parquet file. So connecting to a REST data source, allowing you to connect to multiple different endpoints using a single data source, and then bringing those in as separate tables, and then of course, generating the Parquet files and landing those in my Azure data lake. Awesome. All right, so we have about 4 minutes left on the clock. I do want to open it up and see if there are any questions out there from any of you that I can help clarify.
No questions in the chat window so far.
Okay, there is one thing that I did forget to mention. I did want to talk about, so the question is, how do I use this data source? Obviously, I just walked you through this one, but what if I don't walk you through one, right? You need some documentation. Well, the nice thing about these data sources, any CData data sources have this question mark in the top, right? So we can click on this question mark, okay? And this will open a web page. This will actually open the CData documentation on that specific provider. So this is super cool because we can go right here. One of the areas you want to look at in this menu here is getting started and establishing a connection. This is probably the most important page that you want to view in this documentation when you're trying to get connected to the data source. You're wondering how this specific provider works with CData. As you can see, this REST data source is fairly generic, so there's a lot of different options. Some of these more specific data sources that are connecting to a specific ERP system or cloud service going to be a little bit more specific, but because it's just purely open REST API, there's a lot of options in here. But again, clicking on that question mark up in the top, and then going to getting started and establishing a connection. This is a great insight into how to connect to that, or how to use that REST API to connect to the data source. Looks like we have a lot of questions coming in. How would you need to change the schema setting to lock the RSD files? Oh, great question. So if you wanted to lock the RSD files from changing, you just change this on use, generate schema files, to never. Okay, and that's going to ensure that the RSD files are never modified again, and they won't change. So that is your schema. It will continue to connect to those URIs. Now, another question, can you do incremental loading on REST as well? Absolutely. Again, the prerequisites we have for incremental loading, both in the ODX or in the ODX server, are a reliable primary key. That's important, and some sort of modified timestamp or incremental timestamp. Let's say if it's just incrementing always, you could also use the primary key, as long as that primary key is constantly incremented. So as long as it has those requirements, yes, you can do incremental load on a REST data source. Thank you. I see Taylor's commenting in here as well. Great. Lots of other questions. Yeah. So it's gonna, and how will it pass the incremental criteria? You know, it's going to ask those questions. What is the max timestamp? It'll find those max timestamps underneath the scenes. Some REST APIs won't show you all the data, and it's called pagination, where it actually passes the data to you in chunks, one page at a time. In that case, you do need some additional configuration to set up pagination. You need to make some changes to the RSD file. We do have an article about this in our knowledge base. So you could just search through Google, look for TimeXtender REST pagination. And I'll see if I can just, post the link right in here. So we do have this article in our knowledge base.
Posted again. Yep.
I think you just posted that. Is that, yeah. You got that. Thank you. And so there's some additional configuration there. Another question, query parameters. I'm not quite sure what you mean by that. Authentication methods. Yeah. CData supports many different authentication methods. As you can see from here, there's, straight HTML authentication, there's Azure Data Lake authentication, there's AWS authentication. So take a look at that documentation. You'll find a lot of information on how to authenticate to these different providers. Each provider is unique, so it depends on the provider. But take a look at that REST API's documentation for information on authentication. We do have another KB article on OAuth authentication, but I will also be covering that topic in a future TimeXtender Tuesdays as well. Okay, so we are all out of time. Thank you so much for the questions.
Excellent. Excellent work, Joseph. I love it when you get going so fast like that. I think I'm going to have to go back and look at the video on slow motion just to keep up. Anyway, thanks everybody for being here today. And we always love to get feedback from you. So I just put a link in the chat there for our feedback form. If you have any suggestions for future topics or any other feedback you'd like to give us, we would love it if you would fill out that form. And otherwise, watch your email box for the notice about the video going up later on this afternoon. And we look forward to seeing you again in 2 weeks.
Thanks so much, everybody.